Welcome to today's chapter of Books and the World. I'm your host on today's program. I'm Bob Silverberg, and my guest sitting right here, right now, is Michael C. Keith, who has a long background in radio and TV. So welcome to the program first, Mike.
Thank you. It's good to be here with an old radio crony.
We might just talk about radio
Why
and
not?
TV.
Why not? That might be fun.
Or I'll sit here and you can interview me.
Sounds good. Here, I've got my notes.
What as they say on radio and TV, but first.
After this message.
Mike is our guest today because he's written a great book called Hoag's Object, H-O-A-G apostrophe S. What is Hoag? Who is Hoag?
Well, it's a galaxy some 100 million light years away, I believe, named after Art Hoag. We were speculating before the interview that we might have the pronunciation of Hoag wrong, Hoag as you say, but yeah. We're hoping it's Hoag because I've been telling everybody that it is.
And why did you choose a galaxy? We have a picture of a galaxy we can bring up. And it's a circle.
Spiral galaxy.
A spiral within a circle.
Yeah.
It's a very different sort of a galaxy. According to the Hubble pictures, they're always spread out and weird and eerie. But this one is rather concise.
Yeah, I think that's what attracted me to it, just the geometry of it. What I had read also is that it was formed by colliding into other galaxies. So that kind of became a useful metaphor because so many of the characters in my book or in the short story collection are colliding into aspects of their lives and other people. So I thought, why not?
Well, I don't know. It fits perfectly. Having read your book, it's this collection of short stories in here. And they're fascinating, first of all. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And they always have a turn. You know, you speak of the comet and the circle. Right. There's always a little twist in there.
Yes, yeah. I think that was kind of a little bit of it, that O. Henry kind of resolve or ending, which is a lot of fun to try to work with.
Now, I know from the notes in the book itself, Mike, that you've written many books. Is this a little different than some of the others, and in what way?
Yeah, well, my writing career has principally consisted of nonfiction books. As a matter of fact, most of my books are about media, and I've had some 24 books on media published, focusing overwhelmingly on radio. So, yeah, this is certainly a departure. In particular, because it deals with the short story genre, which I really hadn't worked in up until 3 or 4 years ago. I'd never written any short stories at all. And so, yeah, it's quite a departure.
Now, from nonfiction to fictional short stories, it is quite a leap.
Yeah.
Were you comfortable with short stories, or did you have to work on them? Or?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting thing, and I'll make, in the interest of full disclosure, a confession here, that I was never a huge fan of short stories. I didn't read much in way of short stories. Read a lot of novels, enjoyed those, and biographies, but short stories I was always kind of not apprehensive about, but I wasn't attracted to greatly. And so it kind of surprises me that I would end up being so immersed in the genre as a writer. And it's whet my appetite a little bit to read other short story writers now.
What is the formula for a short story? Is there a set of informal, formal rules?
Yeah, you know, I'm not that terribly well versed in the academics of the short story. I just kind of let it flow. But I think, you know, because of the concise nature of the genre, you have to kind of try to hit the home run when you're up the first time. And it has to have an organic nature to it. It has to have, you know, the proverbial 3-part compositional framework, the open, the middle, and the close, although not all short story writers employ that. Some of them get to the second part and just leave you there.
Well, it's a short story. Let's get going.
Exactly that. So, and I've also learned that there's a lot of different types of lengths of short stories, if that's appropriate to say. There's flash fiction, there's microfiction, there's short stories and long short stories and whatnot, and I'm kind of all over the landscape.
Where do you get your ideas? Because they're fascinating in your
Yeah.
book, Hoag's Object.
Probably from a demented mind. That's where they come from. Actually, not to be facetious, but when I was a youngster, I was always fascinated with science fiction, the macabre. I used to listen to way back Inner Sanctum.
Oh, yes.
You know, and then on television, The Twilight Zone, science fiction theater, and they were among my favorite programs. I just loved that. And into adulthood, my favorite form of reading was typically in the science fiction, in the horror realm. So I think that's where the flavor of these stories emanates.
Yeah, they kind of take off and go in odd directions.
Yeah.
They're not really spacey, to use a throwaway word, but no, they're not. And yet I was reading, as I read all through the book.
You're a brave person to have done that. Few interviewers actually read whole books. We were talking about that.
No, it was a pleasure.
So you're a credit to your profession.
Thank you, Mike. And this program's going along swimmingly. Yeah. But I was wondering, somewhere about halfway through now, would our guest, Michael Keith, see an everyday object? We're just going down to the grocery store, driving to work, or casually at home. See an object and take a new look at it, and suddenly something would start turning.
Yeah, absolutely.
A wheel within a wheel. We're back to our astral.
Right. Yeah, absolutely, no doubt about it. So many of these stories and other stories that I've done have been triggered by something that I've witnessed in a commonplace venue, or watching the news. Something has stirred me. I'll give you an example.
Yes, please.
There's a story in, I believe, this collection. We're focusing on this collection, but this is my third collection. That I was watching the news about a year ago, and they had a story about the Maldives, the islands off the coast of India that are sinking.
Yes.
And this is an island nation. And so the entire nation is on the cusp of disappearing, of vanishing. And the president or the prime minister of the island has been looking all around the world for a place to relocate his population of 100,000 people and whatnot. And I thought, what a peculiar situation. And a title popped into my head out of nowhere. And the title was My Drowning Country. And it was to me, it was like, what if we as Americans were in a similar situation? You love your country, but you're seeing it disappear. And so that led me to write a short story on the premise of a small atoll or small island that was sinking, that was only occupied by 2 people, and one of those people who had passed away the very day the island started sinking. And the young girl was left with her deceased aunt. She's 16 and has to get the aunt off the island because she wants to give her a proper burial.
She can't even bury her on what's left of the island because it won't be there.
Precisely that, and that to me felt like it would inspire some good story writing.
All right, now to give away one of the stories in your book on this island country that's disappearing, so what did you do with it? Where did it go for you?
In that particular story?
In this particular story.
Yeah. Well, first of all, what I had to do was become familiar with the culture. What are people like on the Maldives, and how many islands are there, and so I did a little reading, a little research, and I then concocted the story of this young girl who is faced with the fact that she's on this little wooden rowboat or canoe or whatever you want to call it, and she can no longer see land. It's all disappeared. It's just completely disappeared.
Wow, and where do you go?
And where do you go? And she doesn't even know where she's going. All she wants to do is find a place where she can bury her aunt. And then it goes into kind of a mythological realm where different forces come
She
into
starts
play.
to see things.
Yeah, she has hallucinations. She recalls her life when she lived with her family, who happened to be on an island that sunk, and they were lost. So all of this comes into play. And it
Do
was
you
kind of
ever
fun playing.
wonder, after you've written the book, and my question to some authors is, where did that come from?
Yeah, you wonder about that. Yeah, I think of that a lot. I think I've just got done about a week ago writing my 100th story.
Wow.
And it's all of that's taken place in 3 years. And I wonder what opened the floodgates on something that I didn't even know existed. I'd written nonfiction books. I did write a memoir that was published by Algonquin Books in 2003.
Is that the radio station?
No, the radio station is a textbook, and
Oh.
it's the most widely adopted textbook in the country. But my memoir, which was published by Algonquin, as I said, is called The Next Better Place, and it was published in 2003, 2004. So a memoir, as Tony Early said, is a combination of memory and imagination. So that kind of got me over the wall between nonfiction and fiction, since it was part imagination and I had to reconstruct some things. Although I remained true to the facts, there were certain things 40 or 50 years later that I couldn't remember certain names or where we were located at the time, so I had to construct all of that, but maintain the facts, you know.
Yeah, but the mind is a wonderful thing. If you're thinking
yeah.
of the past and suddenly for some reason and no particular discernible reason,
All of a
you
sudden-
say, bingo,
Yeah.
you could see the street, the name of the kid next to you in school.
Just so with such clarity. And what started me into the phase of short story writing was, as I recalled, I woke up one morning and my mother was on my mind, and she had just passed away about a year or two before that. And we had a couple of unresolved issues, as so many families do.
Yeah.
And the title of a story just entered my head, The Everlasting Sorrow of Silence. And that became, really a metaphor for the story or the relationship between me and my mother. So that morning I got up and sat down and
Suddenly the story was there.
it was there.
Oh, it was there.
And so it had to have been there all along, as I think all of these stories had to have been there all along.
Well, it had to come from
They
someplace.
had to come from someplace. Although, as you've said, Bob, some of them are pretty odd and unusual and bizarre. So I wonder how come these things are there.
You finish it, then look in the mirror, you say, wait a minute.
Yeah, really. You look under your bed, open your closet. Yeah, as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, a number of people I know who have known me for years, who started reading my short stories, were concerned about me. I had a couple of them call up and say, "Are you okay, Michael? Are you?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'm fine. It's just the creative imagination."
I can hear that conversation. I've just finished reading your story about,
Yeah.
whoa.
Well, yeah. As a matter of fact, a couple of members of my family asked me when they read that particular story about my mother, they wanted to know, well, what was that all about? And I said, look, most of it is just imagination. Writers, it's poetic license. You just go with the imagination, and it takes you to where it takes you.
I would imagine after your imagination gave you the finish for the stories, the wrap up, the end,
The end,
of the
yeah.
stories, that the next one might be a little easier.
Yeah.
Is it, or do you still have where am I going to go from here?
Well, I think you have both of those things. It's interesting. After I wrote the first couple of stories, I thought, well, that's good. Now I've written a couple of stories, so be it. Now I'll go back and I'll write those nonfiction books in my field and whatnot. But I had reached a point, too, where I had written for 25 years in my field and had published very extensively, perhaps more than anybody in the area of radio studies. And I was, to be quite frankly, at a point where I had enough of it. So that's why I ventured into the short story. But when I wrote the first couple, I thought, well, that's probably probably all that's there. I mean, that's about it. And lo and behold, the following week, another idea, and you're back at it, and then another idea. And I've averaged a short story every week or 10 days for the last 3 years.
Really?
You know, and some have come very, easily, have glided right in there, and that's a wonderful experience when they do. But as a writer, anybody's a writer, writing is work. You have to sit down there, you have to be disciplined, you have to look at that blank page, and it's fraught with anxiety, a certain level of anxiety. Until I'm done with a story, or until I'm really confident that I know how the story is going to end, there's always anxiety attached to it, and then there's satisfaction and elation once you've got the draft. Mm-hmm. Once I have the draft, the weight's lifted from my shoulders.
In case you've just joined us, we're sitting here today with our guest Michael C. Keith, and the book that brought us together is called Hoag's Object. Hoag's is a galaxy a few billion miles away.
Yeah.
And it's a wheel within a wheel.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you've done your research.
You quote, before each of your stories in this book, Mike, you have a little quote from somebody. It might be an author or a philosopher, a songwriter.
I love doing that, and what I do is I finish the story, I think about what the story has said or is trying to say, then I go and look for a quote that, in a sense, telegraphs what's in there, but at the same time might give it a little bit greater diversity of meaning too. It's like hooking onto someone's tailcoats. If he's quoting Milton or Dickens, then he must know about literature, so maybe the story is, but it's not a smokescreen.
Gives a little enhancement.
A little credibility.
In fact, we mentioned songs. One of your stories near the end mentions Wheel Within a Wheel, which is a lyric.
Yes, Alan and Mary Bergman,
to a song that Michel Legrand wrote the music for. And it showed up in the Thomas Crown Affair.
Absolutely. And it won the Oscar for Best Song.
Yes, for Best Song.
Yeah, a wonderful song. And maybe that was also in my head when I discovered the existence of Hoag's Object, or Hoag's Gallery.
When I reached that quote before the story that goes with it in your book, I said, there it is, the wheel within a wheel, which brings us back to the picture on the front of your book of the galaxy of the wheel within the wheel.
Spinning wheel within the wheel.
And the world keeps turning.
Yeah, in the windmills of your mind.
Now, I have a question for you. It's a personal one that you may or may not want to answer, because having read some of the couple of 2, 3, maybe into 4 of these stories, the women in your stories do not fare too well.
Uh-oh, I'm in trouble.
And you don't have to answer any personal questions here, but some of the wives leave, take off, are done away with. So that's one of my notes. What's it got against women?
That's a good observation, but I will say in my defense that my wife is the first reader of a draft.
And if it's still in there after she's read it.
Well, that's right. So I figure if it goes through her filter, and she doesn't take umbrage to it or accuse me of being a misogynist, that it's okay. But but there are heroic women in the story, such as in the one I mentioned to you, My Drowning Country. Vivace is a very heroic figure, and but maybe coming from a man's perspective, that my I don't know, perspective, I suppose, it comes from a lot of that masculine view of a woman as a victim. Oftentimes they are victims in here, and oftentimes they're at the mercy of men for one reason or another. Or I think what I try to do generally is make it as realistic as I can, albeit within a bizarre context.
Now, speaking of bizarre context, in one of your stories, Mike Keith, there's the story of a painting, and the man in the story owns the painting, and it gives him great joy.
Yeah.
He has it on the wall, and when he passes it, he looks at it and feels better.
Sure, we all do that.
But you've twisted this, Mike.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give away part of the story. I won't give away the ending of it, but I'm going to give away part of the story because it's fascinating. It's a good story. The picture, the painting that gives the man in the story such pleasure, it turns out, was painted by Adolf Hitler.
A bummer, isn't that? And of
Now,
course, the
yeah,
gentleman is a
I
Jewish gentleman to boot.
Yes, you make him a Jewish gentleman who owns the painting, painted by Hitler.
Yeah.
And I reached that point and I said, oh.
What do you do with that?
What do you do? Yeah,
Oh,
I'm not
my
going to
God.
give the ending. Huh?
Yeah, and it just, what do you do with something that you find out has a malevolent source?
Yeah.
That it was created by one of the most hateful figures, and yet the picture has given you joy and pleasure because you correspond with the aesthetic that's in the picture. And then you learn, what do you do?
Or what idea gave you the inspiration to write that short story, Mike?
Good question. I had a number of years ago come across either an article or I don't know what it was, but I saw some paintings that Adolf Hitler did. And I looked at them and I looked at them and I tried to see the devil that was in him in those pictures, and I thought the pictures are so benign. There's no hostility, no premonition or foreshadowing of what this horrible individual created. And I thought, talk about duality. Talk about how so many extreme points can exist in the soul of one individual. And that's when I thought, well, what happens then if this good Jewish gentleman discovers the painting that he's cherished, that was handed down to him,
that brings him joy.
That brings him joy, that he's getting joy out of the personage of Adolf Hitler. So it just struck me as a real interesting juxtaposition.
It certainly is. It certainly is. I have a feeling that we're surrounded by a couple of plants here on our TV studio
Potted
platform.
plants.
Yeah. I have a feeling that if you looked at this plant behind me or the one over your shoulder, that you could create some sort of story about why is that plant or what is it doing?
What is that doing behind Bob right now?
Yeah.
I think something's going on.
Is it moving?
Well, something, during the whole interview, that plant has moved closer to you, Bob, so I think you better be careful.
After our conversation so far, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all. I want to do a little bit of reading because on page 172, you have a copy of the book. Would you turn to page 172, please?
172.
While we open up the book by our guest, a book called Ho's Objects.
Okay.
Turn to page 172.
I got it.
All right. I don't have it yet.
It's right after 171 and before 173.
Oh, that's where it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Do I have the right page here? Oh, I'm sorry, 275.
Oh, 275.
275.
We'll go there now.
Hold on while we read.
While we find our pages here.
Yeah. It's called Stakes of Wrath.
Oh, yeah, this is,
Now, we don't have time to read the whole thing, Mike, but would you just start, please, for us?
Okay. Stakes, do you want me to read the Steinbeck quote or just read the story?
No, start with the story.
Okay.
Please.
Jody was no ordinary Angus.
Talking about a cow.
Oh, yes, yeah, right. Fate had endowed him with the ability to discern human intentions, and although that may have seemed a great gift, it proved more a horrible burden to the omniscient bovine. You want me to continue?
Yeah.
He knew he was destined for the slaughterhouse. As is the sad plight of most cattle, he had the misfortune of being born into a world that wished to devour him, one that saw him only as porterhouse, sirloin, T-bone, ribeye, and flank steak. Humans fed him not out of compassion, but so they could more sumptuously feast on him. Indeed, nobody took Jody's feelings into account, and he had feelings, profound feelings. Foremost among them was a passionate desire to avoid the human dinner table.
Yeah. Now I'm going to turn the page because the cow, realizing that his end is near, decides to let the people around him know that he's not just another cow.
Not just an ordinary cow.
So he goes into a dance. He says, Jody, the cow, then decided to pull out all the stops and perform the Andrew Lloyd Webber songbook, thinking it might be his salvation. So he launched into music of the night. Another bucket of water was heaved in his direction. And then he goes into a dance to let them know that he's not just a regular cow.
Right.
But it doesn't do him all that good.
Nope. He tries and tries as he might, but he ends up at the edge of a stun gun.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of an anti-vivisectionist or anti-meat. I'm not a vegan, and I'm not a vegetarian, and I probably had a steak that night. Sorry, but I could feel for the plight of any animal at all. And,
but you express it so differently, and that's what makes the story so interesting.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, it was one of those I did in a day. I wrote it a day or two, and I sent it off thinking, well, it's a little frivolous piece. And then the magazine that published it nominated it for the Pushcart Prize. Oh. And I thought, of all stories, that one little 3-pager does that.
I'm holding a card that you gave me earlier. It's called Of Night and Light. This is a book, the new book of yours?
Yes, yeah. It's a new collection of short stories that's due out in June. Has about the same number of short stories in it, and probably a lot of them resemble the type of stories that are in Hoag's Object in theme, if anything else. Maybe a little bit broader in the nature of the stories.
Mm-hmm. And there will be more?
I hope. As a matter of fact, I'm working on what I hope to be a 4th collection called A Boy in the World. And
short stories?
Yes, and all the stories have to do with the experiences of young adults, boys and young adults. And
once you got started on the short story form that you said was new to you, you had no stopping you.
Yeah, I hope it continues. I hope I don't wake up one morning a tabula rasa in terms of creative ideas, but you never know, so I'm just taking advantage of it at the moment.
Or you're halfway through a story and the whole
Don't
thing
say
stops.
that, Bob. Don't say that.
I didn't say it. We'll erase that part.
Okay, good.
And speaking of erasing that part, we reached the end of the program.
This has been a lot of fun.
I would recommend the book that we're talking about today, Hoag's Object. And you'll find a picture of the Hoag galaxy on the front cover, but the stories are not about astronomy. They are about a wonderful collection of different people and a cow and a whole bunch of paintings and everything else, and I recommend it heartily, and I thank you much this afternoon for being our guest on the program.
It's been a pleasure. I've had a lot of fun here. Thanks to you.
And we thank you for looking in, and the book is called Hoag's Object by our guest Michael Keith. We hope you enjoyed today's program enough to join us again on Books and the World, a presentation of the Cape Cod Writer Center. Thanks for viewing.